In looking at John chapter 5, there's something that stands out here, and that is the danger of our beliefs, especially if they're unproven. The things that you believe are very powerful, and I know we all know that, but there's so many ways that we could illustrate that, and it's illustrated very well in this text. Just as a way to start off, though, I ran across an article that was actually written in 2015 and by the BBC. And it was about a study that was done on depression medication. So they have to do trials, and people are in these tests, and they have it's called a double-blind trial study. And they have some people who are getting the real medicine and some people who are getting a placebo, and no one knows who's getting what. Well, there's a person that knows, but that way no one else is aware of what's happening. That way they can test the results of the drug by itself. And we all know that there are problems with this because there is a such thing as a placebo effect, and it's been well documented for a long time. But this was an interesting situation because it was documented and then was published in an article about a doctor who ran across a man who was in this study. They didn't know he was in the study, but he was in the study for depression medication. The ER that he went to didn't understand what was happening, but he decided one day that he had had enough and he wanted to kill himself. And so he just drank the whole bottle of pills. And then, as typically happens, he regretted it. And so he rushed himself to the hospital. And by the time he got there, he was in very bad shape. He was hyperventilating. His blood pressure had dropped extremely low, and they were very worried. They were very concerned. He's about to die, and they're doing everything that they can to find out what's going on. And he tells them about this drug that he's studying, and they realize this drug now that they don't even realize what the drug is. But with all these problems, they are extremely concerned about this man, and so they reach out to the manufacturer, the person who was doing the study, and they're very confused because what they found was they couldn't find any drugs in his system at all. And this drug that he had taken a whole bottle full, they couldn't find it, so they're scratching their head, and finally word came back that the man was in the placebo part. He'd actually downed sugar pills, but he thought they were real. And here he is about to die because he thought he poisoned himself. There are many, many instances of that actually happening. There's stories all around. I've heard stories of a man who believed at a certain time he was going to die for whatever reason, and that's when he died. And the reason people think that he died was because he believed he was going to die. Our beliefs have an extreme amount of power over our bodies to a great degree. That's why the placebo works. And that can't be argued against. The placebo effect is well documented. So I'm not suggesting that our beliefs are everything or that they're magical, but they are powerful. And that brings us to a very important point, and that is that your beliefs have great power. And because of that, we have a responsibility to make sure that the things we believe are true and accurate. But we generally think about that, and especially in the church, we talk about beliefs, and we think about in terms of doctrines, right? We have to believe that Jesus is the Christ. We have to believe that you need to repent and be baptized in order to be saved. There's so many doctrines that we have, but even in response to that, we also have other things that are opinions that we form based upon different ideas that are presented in the gospel. In fact, in our Bible classes, we talk a lot about those kinds of things. And, I don't have any problem with bringing up opinions, but we need to recognize what they are and recognize that they are opinions. And to be very careful about the conclusions that we draw, because if we believe the wrong thing about the wrong thing, we can be in a lot of trouble. We're seeing that here. So we get into John chapter 5, and the first 4 verses we talked about in Bible class a little bit, and that is the legend of the stirred up water. It says, after this was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gates a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, and paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had. Now, I put legend in quotes because we discussed this morning that this particular verse, especially verse 4 and the end of verse 3 about the stirring of the waters, There's some dispute about whether or not it should be in there. And in fact, in some Bibles, it's not even listed in there. And so we have to look at this, and this is not going to be a lesson on how we determine whether it should be there or not. I'm going to leave that to other times. But it is important to recognize what's happening. And if this was the case, then if this was actually what John said was actually what happened, and an angel came down, then that changes things a little bit. But if it's not supposed to be there, then it also gives us an understanding that's a little bit different than we would if we had this going on. It doesn't change the meaning, though. But excuse me. I wanted to bring that up because it brings up the idea of what if this really was fake? What if this really was a legend? We've heard tales and stories of healing pools all over the world, and they're legends. They're many times mythological. We hear these kinds of things, and people will dedicate great amounts of resources to go and be healed in these places when they're really not being healed at all, but they can be convinced of it. So the question I wanted to ask, and this is what was brought to me, and whenever I first started reading this, I realized something's different here, and I looked into it, and the more I look into it, the more I realize maybe there's some dispute here, but what if this was just a legend, and John's simply recording that it's a legend? How does that change things? It changes things because there were a whole lot of people there who were believing something that was not wrong to believe, but was wrong in the sense that it was inaccurate. And so here they are. Can you imagine if they, because of natural occurrences in the fountains or whatever, maybe wind blowing a leaf around, people say the water's been stirred, and the rush to get into the water to be the first one there so that they could be healed. Can you imagine what that could have been like? I mean, trampling all over you. I know if I were in that case, I would be pulling out all my football training, and I would be doing everything I could to get to that water first, because I want to be healed. Everyone else would be the same way. So this could be a dangerous situation, but more importantly, look at the false hope that's there if this is just a legend, which it could be. The things that we believe affect the way we live. So it's important what we believe. Now, this verse is not really important in the grand scheme of things. It's not really important in this text. It's not even really important in the sermon that I'm preaching, because there's something more important here that's still a false belief that still should be discovered. But I want you to see that, and I recognize the irony of looking at a passage and talking about false beliefs, and we're not even sure what to believe about this passage. But think about it with me here. The misunderstanding led to a lot of heartache, if that's indeed what happened. There were a lot of people who were waiting to be healed who never were. Have you ever seen people at healing ceremonies or different churches? I've never really been to one, but I've seen them. I've seen them especially on television. I've seen people. I saw a man one time who was in a wheelchair, and he rolled him up, and I don't even remember who it was. Walked up to him, put his hand on his head, and said, "You're healed. Stand up. In faith, stand up." And he stood up, and his legs were just rickety. I mean, he was barely standing up. And that healer went behind him and just kicked that chair out of the way. And he said, "Walk." You know how much pressure was on that man to walk when you got thousands of people looking at you? So what did he do? Just like that. He walked about 10 paces, turned around, and the whole time he had his hands up in the air. "Praise God, I'm healed." I never saw a healing like that in the Bible. They were healed instantly, without drama. He touched them or said a word, and they were healed. The man wasn't healed. He was walking with adrenaline. And he walked back, and the man who supposedly healed him walked away and started praising God. And they actually caught a glimpse of him in the camera, because they have different camera angles, right? I see that man walking, trying to get to his chair so he can sit back in it. And then he rolled himself off. You think that man went home thrilled or depressed? Why am I not good enough? It has nothing to do with that man. It had everything to do with the one claiming to do the healing. But they always blame it on the one who isn't healed, right? These misunderstandings and these false hopes can give so much heartache to people. It does matter what we believe. The Pharisees had a belief problem too. If you look in these passages here, it was rooted in the Sabbath law. If you look at chapter 5 and starting at verse 6, Jesus saw him lying there, knew he had already been in that condition a long time. He said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" And the sick man said, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. While I'm coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed and walked, and that day was the Sabbath. The Jews therefore said to him who was cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed." And he answered them, "He who made me well said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" And they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" But the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. So now they have this situation where this man was actually healed by Jesus, and he's walking around and probably very happy. And a Pharisee saw him and couldn't have that. He couldn't have him being happy and joyful. So he walked up to him and said, "Hey, you can't carry your bed around. You're breaking the Sabbath." Of all the things that had happened, the thing that man noticed the most was not that the man was healed, but that he was breaking some law, some ceremonial law that the Jews actually created themselves. Now, Moses gave the Sabbath law, no question about that. But the way that they interpreted it is the problem. They had a belief, an opinion based upon the law. The law said, "Do no work." And they interpreted that in many different ways. And because of that, they caused all kinds of problems. They had good intentions, maybe. I don't know if that's the case or not, but I try to give them the benefit of the doubt that they probably were doing it so that they can protect people from breaking the Sabbath. You can't break the Sabbath by working if you're not allowed to do anything at all. So, you can stand up and walk, but you can only walk to a certain amount of space. You can pick things up, but it can evidently be only a certain weight that you can carry. You can do certain things, but they had so many restrictions, and it was simply as a fence to keep them from actually violating the Sabbath, because that was definitely wrong, and they were trying to keep people from that. You also could make the argument that they like to control people, and they wanted to be in control, and they wanted to be in charge. They wanted to be able to look down on other people. When they had to go do certain things and the Pharisees didn't, they could look around and say, "Look at how much better I am than they are," and continue to support their idea of themselves being superior, and the riffraff around them being the sinners and the tax collectors who really don't amount to anything anyway. I don't know what they did. I don't know why they did it, but I do know that they created all kinds of laws. So here they are accusing this man of breaking the Sabbath because he rolled up his bed and was walking home. Then if you look then at verses 16 through 18, we see the reason this is such an important idea. Now, first of all, I want to clarify that there is nothing wrong, if you're following the Sabbath, there would be nothing wrong with saying, I'm not going to pick anything up all day on the Sabbath. It would be wrong to say that everyone else had to keep from picking things up. But for you, there's nothing wrong with it. And I think everyone would agree with that. The basic intention of the Sabbath law was take a day off. So in taking a day off, I'm going to have, that can be defined in many ways. There was a time in my life when I thought day off means I spend the whole day in bed. I didn't do anything. I was tired and pretty much just laid around and slept all day. Might get up and read or play a video game or something. You remember those days back in the good old days when you could just lay around and do nothing? But I've learned since then you don't have to do that to have a day off, right? But if you believe that all you could do is lay around in bed all day on the Sabbath, then great. There's nothing wrong with that. But to require of everyone else, that's definitely wrong, because they're not violating the scriptures just because they get out of bed. So this is a very important idea, and their interpretation of Moses' law is the problem. And the thing is they believed that it was wrong, and that's a problem. Then, in fact, the problem starts in verse 16. It says, "For this reason the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, my Father has been working until now, and I have been working. Therefore the Jews sought all the more to kill him, because he not only broke the Sabbath, but he also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. So there's two strikes against him now. They have first the interpretation of the law of Moses when breaking the Sabbath that they accused Jesus of doing. And because of that, if you break the Sabbath law, you were to be put to death. Now, the way that they interpreted the scriptures, it pretty well put them and forced them into the only conclusion they could draw was either we have to admit that we're wrong about the Sabbath, or we've got to put Jesus to death because he's breaking the Sabbath. You see how the ideas, the opinions that became laws in their minds were so dangerous. There was nothing wrong with their opinion about what they should do on the Sabbath, but when it became a law in their mind, they started applying that to everyone else, and now we have a serious problem. And that problem is they're going to have to put Jesus to death. And it led to the conspiracy against him to put him to death. And in fact, it goes further and further on in that. We're going to see that actually you can see that next week. I don't know if it's going to be covered in Bible class or not, but in looking at John chapter 9, you see that even more. And Jesus actually is even doing things, it seems, after this. He starts doing things to cause people to look at him and say, you're breaking the Sabbath. He's going out of his way to violate their idea of what the Sabbath is to prove a point. And he's pressing the issue. The reason is because he knows he's going to die. He's working it out so that he will die, and he knows how it's going to happen, but he also knows it's going to be on his terms. But in this particular case in John chapter 5, they're seeking for a reason to kill him or an opportunity to kill him because he is violating what they think he shouldn't do. And then on top of that, he said that his Father was working and would continue to work. You see, that's the thing, is he called God his Father, and they said, oh, look at that blasphemy. He's putting himself equal to God. You know, there's an interesting part to that. It's kind of a side note, but Jesus was accused of that many times, and he never argued with it. He probably intended for them to understand it that way. There are people actually going around today saying Jesus never claimed to be God. They haven't read much of the New Testament because he said it over and over and over. In John chapter 9, he said it very distinctly, and actually at the end of chapter 8, very distinctly, saying that he was the I am. You can't get around it. And Jesus is claiming to be God, and they were looking at him, and instead of looking at the miracles that actually proved that he's the Son of God, and considering the fact that maybe he might have something that we need to listen to because look at these great miracles, they simply denied the miracles and decided to kill him. You know, they did the same thing when he raised Lazarus from the dead. You remember what happened with that? They looked around. They saw that here's Lazarus walking around. Here is a walking testimony of the power of Jesus. And what did they do? They wanted, instead of praising God and thanking him that he sent the Messiah to them, which they had been looking for centuries, instead of doing that, they looked at him and they looked at Lazarus and said, you know what we need to do with that guy is we need to kill him, because he's saying too much about Jesus just by being alive. And by the way, we need to kill Jesus too on top of it, so he won't go around doing this kind of stuff anymore. Amazing. But the reason was not simply because they just looked at Jesus and he was offensive to them. It wasn't because he was rude and caustic. It wasn't because he fashioned a whip of cords one too many times and cleaned out the temple. And it wasn't because he insulted them. It was because they believed things that they painted themselves into a corner based upon their beliefs, and they had no choice to be consistent with their lives. They had no choice but to kill Jesus. Isn't it amazing how Satan works on us? You know, when you're Christian and you're doing the right thing, that's the time we need to be the most consistent, and it's usually the time we have the hardest time being consistent is when we're doing what's right. But, you know, it's amazing to me how consistent I can be in doing what's wrong. Have you ever noticed that? If it's something I shouldn't be doing, oh, it's easy to do that. It's easy to continue to build a habit with that. But if you try to make a habit of doing something that's good and effective and build your relationship with God, why are those so hard to build? I don't know, but they are. They're easy to get distracted from. But if you want to do something wrong, sure, I guess Satan may even help you do those things habitually. And here's a situation where these Jews had everything worked out in their minds incorrectly, but they had it all worked out. They had a system of explaining one thing, explained another, and they built upon this empire of sand that was based on false ideas and false assumptions, because they didn't understand how powerful their beliefs were and how important it was that they got it right. How many times do we do that same thing? There's a proverb that says, the one who makes his case in court first is the one who's easiest to believe. You believe that man until you hear the other side of the story. And a lot of times we're seeing this in our society so much. We go online, and the first thing we're looking for, we usually have an idea what we want it to say. The first thing that we see that we can agree with, that feels right and just seems like it works, the first thing we see of that, we just assume that it's right. We never even consider the fact that there may be other opinions and other ideas. And so we just swallow it whole. I'm speaking us as in general of our society. We swallow it whole and then start defending it, even though we haven't even looked at anything anyone else has said. We never do that in the church, right? We do. It's so important for us to recognize that, because what you believe determines what you act, how you act. How you act will also determine other beliefs that you're going to create based upon your actions. It's a vicious cycle. And you're going to support your own ideas. And your brain will find ways to prove your own ideas. And you are going to believe what you want to believe. And that's a fundamental fact of life. You will believe the things that you want to believe. You won't believe the things that you don't want to believe. So here we have the system. I don't know why they started believing these false ideas. I have some ideas, but I don't know why. All I know is they had false ideas of the Sabbath, false ideas of what it meant to call God Father, false ideas of what their role was in life as the policemen and the judges. And that put them in a position of looking at the very Son of God, the very Messiah that they had been waiting for centuries, the one who was going around raising the dead and healing the sick. They looked at that man and said, we have no choice but to put him to death because of their beliefs. Think it's important what you believe? Absolutely. So their misunderstandings led to conspiracy against the Son of God. Well, that is why we need to be very careful. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 33 says, do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good morals. The people that we're around, the ideas that we embrace and espouse, that they espouse and we embrace, or we accept without really thinking about, it's going to change the way you live. It's going to change your behavior. It's going to change the way you see reality. And believe me, Satan is good at twisting reality. The only way we can combat that is to simply go to the Word. Everything you hear, you need to verify. And there are things out in the world that we hear that we assume are right, and they have really nothing to do with what Scriptures say, but we still need to verify it. Just because it's not a matter of doctrine does not mean that it's not dangerous. It can be dangerous. Look at how many churches have shut down in the last 2 years because of some assumptions that we made about COVID. Right or wrong, there were still problems that came. There's still difficulties that came. Everything we believe has consequences. So as Christians, we need to make sure we have integrity and look for truth and hold truth. That's why we have there's so much danger in the unproven beliefs that we have. And we all have them. We all have them. Please take the time to verify what you believe, to look at your beliefs and ask questions. Because it doesn't matter who's right, it matters what's right. But when you figure out what's right, that means that you can also be right. If you're wrong and you find out that you're wrong, praise God, because then you can follow the truth. But if you're right, you want to know that you're right and be able to help other people get there. Praise God for that too. there's anything that we can do for you this morning, if you have any needs or prayers, if you'd like to be baptized for the remission of your sins, whatever it is, I hope that you will not allow your beliefs to take you away from God and take you away from the promises that he's given to us. If there's any way that we can help you, please come as we stand and sing.